25, 1999, at the Long Island Medical Center, one of New York's wealthiest real estate magnates passed away at the age of 93. Within hours, his children began reviewing the details of his will and the enormous property portfolio that was to be divided among them. However, in the weeks that followed, bitter disputes broke out. The children of the magnate's eldest son had been written out of the will. A year later, the two disinherited grandchildren, claiming that their grandfather's will had been altered under undue influence, took their aunt and two uncles, Mary Ann Trump, Robert Trump, and Donald Trump, to court. Thus began the legal battle over the late man's estate, marking yet another saga in the Trump dynasty and the vast business empire he had built. The man's name? Fred Trump, the father of Donald Trump. Fred Trump, remembered in history as the patriarch of the Trump family empire, was born on October 11, 1905 in the Bronx, New York City. His full baptismal name was Frederick Christ Trump. Contrary to later claims, he was not born in New Jersey. His father was Frederick Trump, a German immigrant from the Bavaria region of southern Germany. Fred's grandfather had died of emphysema when Frederick was still a child, forcing him to work from a young age to support his family. This was during a time when Germany had only recently unified in 1871, entering a period of rapid economic growth driven by the Second Industrial Revolution. Yet population pressures also spurred large-scale emigration across Europe. In 1885, at just 16 years old, Frederick Trump joined this exodus, sailing to America. His immigration records upon arrival in New York listed his surname as Trumpf, with an F at the end. Frederick first lived and worked in Manhattan. Then, in 1891, he moved west to Seattle, in the newly admitted state of Washington, before eventually settling in the small town of Monte Cristo. There, he ran restaurants and other establishments, amassing wealth throughout the 1890s. The Klondike Gold Rush was attracting thousands of prospectors to the Yukon, north of Washington state and into Canada, an area that had previously been sparsely populated. Many of these gold seekers traveled north from California through Washington, creating a booming demand for hospitality services like the ones Trump provided. By the end of the decade, Frederick had relocated to British Columbia, closer to the Yukon River, the heart of the gold rush. Although he did some prospecting himself, the real fortune was not in digging for gold, but in supplying the prospectors. As the saying goes, during a gold rush, the safest way to profit is to sell shovels. Frederick Trump thrived by providing food, lodging, and essential supplies, such as pickaxes, pans, and shovels, securing the financial foundation for what would later become the Trump legacy. In 1901, Frederick Trump returned to Germany and soon married. He and his new bride considered settling permanently in Germany. However, when Bavarian officials discovered that he had emigrated to the United States in 1885 to avoid compulsory military service, legal difficulties quickly arose. As a result, the couple decided to return to New York. It was there, in 1905, that their son, Fred, was born. Frederick's wife, whom he had married in 1902, was Elizabeth Christ. She was 11 years younger than her husband, and part of her hesitation about moving permanently to America came from her reluctance to leave her family behind in Germany. Yet with the Bavarian authorities threatening to strip Frederick of his German citizenship over the military service issue, they had little choice but to return to New York. Their first child, a daughter named Elizabeth after her mother, had been born there in April 1904. Fred was their second child, and a third, a son named John, was born in 1907. Fred's childhood was far from typical for the son of European immigrants in New York at the turn of the 20th century. While most immigrant families lived in crowded tenements in neighborhoods like the Lower East Side and struggled to survive, the Trumps enjoyed relative prosperity. Around 1907, when John was born, the family moved to a new housing development in the South Bronx. Each family there had its own bathroom and icebox, and the buildings even employed staff to carry fuel for the fires up to the apartments. By the standards of early 20th century New York, this was considered middle-class comfort. After returning to the city, Frederick worked briefly as a barber, a trade he had apprenticed in as a child back in Germany. But he did not remain in that profession for long. Instead, he used the savings he had made during the gold rush years to invest in property in Queens across the East River from Manhattan. It was a shrewd decision. At the start of the 20th century, Queens was still sparsely populated. However, with the completion of the Queensboro Bridge in 1909, the borough began to attract large numbers of New Yorkers, especially throughout the 1910s. By then, the Trumps had moved there, and Frederick had become a small-scale landlord. Fred and his siblings grew up speaking German at home and playing in a neighborhood that was rapidly changing. Some myths surround Fred's early years. Later in life, he would claim that he began working when he was just 8 or 9 years old, though it is unclear whether this was entirely true. What is certain is that the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, and especially America's entry into the conflict in 1917, made life more difficult for the family. Anti-German sentiment grew strong in New York, and like many German-American families of the time, the Trumps kept a low profile throughout the war years. Frederick simply hoped it would end quickly. Frederick Trump died in May 1918, likely from the Spanish flu, leaving behind a growing real estate business in Queens. His widow, Elizabeth, managed the properties with her children, ensuring the family was financially secure. Fred Trump graduated from Richmond Hill High School in 1923 and ended his formal education. As post-war inflation reduced the family's wealth, Fred took responsibility for expanding the business. He worked as a laborer, carpenter, and studied construction techniques, gaining practical skills. By 1925, he had built 3 small homes in Queens. Since he was not yet of legal age to inherit, the company operated as Elizabeth Trump and Son. Elizabeth handled the finances while Fred managed daily operations, setting the stage for the Trump real estate empire. In the 1920s, Fred Trump struggled to secure bank loans, so he built and sold houses one at a time, reinvesting profits into new projects. By 1926, he had completed 19 homes, and soon entire blocks in Queens bore his name. His houses were simple, affordable, and aimed at young middle-class families. This period marked a turning point in America. Mass European immigration was ending with the Immigration Act of 1924, while the middle class was expanding. Though the Great Depression would slow progress, demand for housing grew, and Fred would eventually provide much of it in New York. However, his early success was not without controversy. By 1927, his name appeared in the New York Times in connection with an incident that would later spark debate. In June 1927, the New York Times reported that Fred Trump had been arrested during a police crackdown on a Ku Klux Klan rally in Queens. At the time, Trump often moved between houses he was building and was listed as residing on Devonshire Road in the Jamaica neighborhood of Queens. The rally escalated into violence involving what the Times described as 1,000 Ku Klux Klan members, several hundred Italian immigrant blackshirts who modeled themselves after Mussolini's fascists in Italy, and the police. While the Klan's primary target was African Americans, in the early 20th century, it also expressed deep hostility toward Roman Catholic immigrants, particularly Italians and Irish, millions of whom had recently settled in America. The confrontation quickly spiraled out of control, and the police clashed with the Klansmen. It remains uncertain whether Fred Trump was arrested as an active participant in the Klan's march, or if he simply happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. What is known is that he was never prosecuted, and no further evidence has ever surfaced linking him to the Ku Klux Klan. Nevertheless, his presence at the rally is documented. For Fred, however, this brief arrest in the summer of 1927 was not the greatest challenge he faced in his 20s. A far more devastating trial came just over 2 years later with the Wall Street crash of October 1929, which ushered in the Great Depression, the worst economic crisis of the 20th century. Construction across America came to a halt for years. The scale of the crisis can be measured by the fate of the Empire State Building. Plans for the skyscraper were announced in August 1929, and the site was cleared for construction in September, just as the stock market began to collapse. Despite the crash, construction proceeded between 1930 and 1931, resulting in the tallest building in the world at the time. Yet for much of the decade, it remained largely empty, symbolizing the depth of the economic downturn, as most of its offices went unoccupied until the late 1930s. In such an environment, Fred Trump's construction business could not thrive. With no credit available and housing demand nearly non-existent, he was forced to diversify. Relying on his remaining funds, he temporarily moved into the grocery business to survive the economic storm. Fred Trump briefly moved into retail during the early 1930s by building one of the first modern supermarkets in Queens, where customers could pick items directly from shelves instead of having a clerk gather them from behind a counter. While commonplace today, this self-service model was revolutionary in the 1930s. Although his heart was not fully in the grocery business, it provided enough income to help him survive the lean years of the Great Depression. Two key events in 1934 transformed Fred Trump's fortunes and set the Trump family on the path to immense wealth. The first was the political shift in November 1932, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt won the U.S. presidential election. Taking office in early 1933, Roosevelt implemented the New Deal, a program of political, economic, and social reforms aimed at pulling the United States out of the Great Depression. A central component was a massive public building initiative to create jobs and expand infrastructure, including roads, bridges, schools, and housing. In 1934, the passage of the National Housing Act created the Federal Housing Administration, FHA, establishing government-backed mortgage programs and protections against foreclosures. Fred Trump quickly leveraged these New Deal mechanisms, beginning large-scale construction of modest homes. By 1936, he employed hundreds of workers and was managing hundreds of housing units and apartments. The second major event was Fred's acquisition of the mortgage portfolio of the bankrupt J. Lerenkrauss Corporation of Brooklyn in January 1934. Through this deal, he obtained numerous properties at greatly reduced prices. Combined with the government's new housing initiatives, this acquisition enabled Fred to prosper throughout the late 1930s. By the early 1940s, he was on his way to becoming one of New York's leading property magnates, benefiting from federal support and funding. During this period, Fred also became a family man. Around the same time he was re-establishing his construction business, he met Mary Ann McLeod at a party. She had immigrated to New York from Scotland in 1930, arriving just as the Great Depression was beginning to take hold. Mary came with very little, yet her meeting with Fred would mark the beginning of a lifelong partnership. Fred Trump married Mary Ann McLeod in 1936, and they had 5 children: Mary Ann, Fred Jr., Elizabeth, Donald, and Robert. He was a strict religious father who ran a disciplined household. By the late 1930s, his real estate business thrived thanks to the New Deal, expanding from Queens into Brooklyn and earning him the nickname Henry Ford of affordable New York housing. The outbreak of World War II and America's entry in 1941 disrupted home construction, while concerns over his German heritage arose, which he addressed by claiming his parents were Swedish. During World War II, Fred Trump expanded his real estate empire by building apartments for U.S. military personnel, primarily in Norfolk, Virginia, and was allowed to retain ownership after the war, greatly increasing his wealth. Fred and his wife Mary also engaged in philanthropy, donating to healthcare institutions like Jamaica Hospital, supporting United Cerebral Palsy, and contributing to Jewish causes, including Israel bonds and local Jewish politicians. After the war ended in 1945, government funding for military housing ceased, prompting Trump to adjust his construction projects. After World War II, Fred Trump capitalized on federal funding for affordable housing for returning veterans, focusing on Brooklyn neighborhoods like Bensonhurst and Brighton Beach. Despite post-war supply challenges, his developments, including Bath Beach, attracted eager buyers. Trump continued to benefit from the Federal Housing Administration, receiving millions for large-scale housing projects with stores and community amenities. He carefully cultivated ties with FHA officials, ensuring his business thrived through the late 1950s. Fred Trump became immensely wealthy as a result of his real estate empire. It is difficult to assign an exact figure, as much of his wealth was tied up in property, the value of which could fluctuate. Regardless, Trump had no intention of selling the thousands of housing units he owned in Queens, Brooklyn, and Norfolk, Virginia. These properties generated millions of dollars in rental income each year. By simply maintaining his holdings, his wealth continued to grow. Fred Trump's success was neither accidental nor a matter of luck. It cannot be attributed solely to being born to a father who had achieved business success, especially considering Frederick Trump died when Fred was very young, leaving the family's financial future uncertain. While this background helped, Fred's achievements were the result of his own initiative, ideas, and strategic thinking. His approach was simple, yet effective. As America grew wealthier in the 20th century, thanks to the labor of millions of European immigrants and freed slaves, the middle class expanded, seeking better housing than the crowded tenements of early 20th century New York. With Manhattan property values skyrocketing, many immigrant families moved from areas like the Lower East Side to boroughs such as Queens and Brooklyn. Fred capitalized on this trend by constructing affordable yet comfortable apartment blocks in these neighborhoods. This was the key to his success. It was not flashy, but consistent, practical, and effective, a hallmark of how great wealth is built in America. Much like Henry Ford, who revolutionized transportation with the Model T by producing it affordably and repeatedly over 2 decades, Fred Trump applied the same principle to post-war affordable housing. The comparison to Henry Ford extends beyond business methodology. Both men were controversial figures in their time. Ford, for example, was notorious for his anti-Semitic publications, a trait that drew public scrutiny. Similar to the controversies surrounding Trump's later career, Fred Trump was a controversial figure. While he aimed to be seen as a decent real estate developer and landlord during the 1920s and 1930s, especially in neighborhoods like Queens where he knew many people, by the 1940s and 1950s, his reputation had shifted. Some accounts describe him as a demanding landlord focused on maximizing profits. The folk singer Woody Guthrie, who lived in Trump's Beach Haven apartment complex in Gravesend, Brooklyn, in the early 1950s, referenced him in songs such as Old Man Trump, criticizing racial segregation in Trump's buildings. While much of this reflected broader societal racism and redlining practices common in mid-20th century America, some critics argue that Fred Trump's policies toward African American tenants were discriminatory. By the mid-1950s, the core of Fred Trump's business empire was firmly established. He had greatly benefited from government financial incentives that began with the New Deal in the mid-1930s, continued through wartime construction, and extended to post-war housing for returning veterans. Government support, including the ability to retain ownership of properties built near military installations like the Norfolk apartments in Virginia, ensured decades of significant rental income. Much of his wealth in the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s came from leasing thousands of apartments and homes he owned, though he also pursued new projects. One ambitious project that did not succeed was the attempted redevelopment of Steeplechase Park in Coney Island, Brooklyn. The amusement park, one of three built at the turn of the century, had become dilapidated and unprofitable by the mid-1960s and closed in 1964. Trump acquired the property, planning to replace it with several 30-story apartment buildings totaling thousands of units. Despite a highly publicized demolition event and much fanfare, the project never came to fruition. Trump ran into a series of zoning and planning issues with the local municipality regarding his Coney Island redevelopment plans. As a result, he leased portions of the property back to Norman Kaufman, who reopened some of the remaining amusements. Trump eventually sold the property to the government for $4 million after purchasing it for $2.3 million. Combined with rental income during that period and more than $1 million he received from a lawsuit against the city, Fred earned several million dollars from the Steeplechase project without ever constructing a single apartment building. By the late 1960s, Fred was planning for the future of his business, now known as the Trump Organization, and strategizing how to pass on his fortune to his children while minimizing inheritance taxes. In 1970, Fred turned 65, slightly below the U.S. life expectancy of 70 years at the time. Though he would live well beyond this age, he began arranging succession. In an era when business in New York was predominantly male-dominated, it was expected that one of his sons would eventually lead the company. Meanwhile, his daughters were following different paths. Marianne was pursuing a legal career and would later become a federal judge, while Elizabeth chose not to engage in the family business and worked as an assistant at Chase Manhattan Bank. Fred's eldest son, Freddie, was initially positioned to lead the company, mirroring Fred's own path after his father's death. By the mid-1960s, Freddie held the position of vice president. However, tensions between father and son eventually grew, and Freddie left to pursue a career as an airline pilot. According to his daughter Mary, family conflicts contributed to Freddie's later struggle with alcoholism. With Freddie stepping away, Fred prepared his second eldest son, Donald, to take over the business. Donald joined the Trump Organization in 1968, shortly after receiving a deferment from military service in Vietnam due to bone spurs in his heels. After several years of preparation, Fred promoted Donald to president of the Trump Organization in 1971. This promotion marked a gradual transition, as Fred retained control over significant portions of his property empire well into his later years. After Fred Trump's death, Donald became the acting manager of the Trump Organization. Over the years, Fred reportedly advised Donald to adopt a ruthless attitude, describing him as a killer in business. He also emphasized putting rivals at a disadvantage. For example, Fred held meetings where guests were seated on uneven chairs facing direct sunlight, creating a physically awkward and psychologically weak position. Some studies suggest that Donald may have inherited his father's approach to tenant management in their large apartment and housing complexes. By the early 1970s, the Trump Organization faced legal disputes with the Department of Justice over alleged racial discrimination in rental practices. In the mid-1970s, tenants in older wartime complexes in Virginia sued the family over poor conditions and rodent infestations, resulting in Fred being briefly arrested in 1976. Fred tried to instill his business philosophies in Donald, but his son often charted his own course. While Fred had avoided flashy projects and the public spotlight, Donald sought attention and aimed to make a name for himself in New York society. This became clear when he steered the company into the Manhattan real estate market in the late 1970s, a market fundamentally different from Queens and Brooklyn, where Fred had built his fortune through large, modestly priced apartment complexes. Manhattan's market involved high property prices and skyscrapers, which Fred had deliberately avoided. Determined to break into Manhattan, Donald acquired a site at 5th Avenue and 56th Street and began construction of Trump Tower in 1979. Completed in 1983, the 58-story building's residential apartments sold out quickly, reflecting the demand for high-end Manhattan real estate. In the early 1980s, the United States and the Western world entered a period of significant economic growth and revitalization after the stagnation of the 1970s. The success of Trump Tower was partly due to this economic climate and partly because of the publicity Donald generated for the project. Fred Trump observed his son's achievement and must have been pleased. As Donald prepared to enter the Manhattan real estate market, tensions within the wider Trump family were becoming a serious concern. Freddie's alcoholism worsened during the 1970s, exacerbated by the perception that he had been marginalized within the family due to Donald's rise. His attempts to become a pilot with Trans World Airlines were thwarted by his drinking. He returned to work in the family business, performing day-to-day operations and handyman tasks, which brought its own humiliation. Meanwhile, Donald acquired land on 5th Avenue to build Trump Tower. Freddie's marriage to Linda Clapp collapsed, and he drank even more heavily, ultimately dying of an alcohol-induced heart attack in 1981 at the age of 42. He left behind 2 children, Fred Trump III and Mary Trump, whose inheritance later became a contentious issue. Donald later stated that his lifelong abstinence from alcohol was influenced both by his father's teetotalism and the impact of his brother's struggles. Freddie's children argue that his alcoholism was partially the result of marginalization within the family, and it could also explain why Donald repeatedly advised his own children, particularly Barron, never to drink or smoke. After Trump Tower opened in 1983, it was a major success. Fred trusted his son's abilities and began providing him with substantial financial support, allowing Donald to expand further. While Fred still controlled a large portion of the property empire he had built since the 1930s, millions of dollars were loaned to Donald, who simultaneously borrowed heavily to expand rapidly in Manhattan. This period coincided with an economic boom and efforts to regenerate parts of New York that had become run down and crime-ridden during the 1960s and 1970s. Donald emerged as the public face of consortiums that acquired and redeveloped large numbers of hotels and commercial properties, obtaining hundreds of millions of dollars in financing to fuel these ventures. The problem with the 1980s economic boom was that, like any modern boom, prices eventually reached levels that were no longer reasonable, and buyers risked substantial losses if the market collapsed. This is essentially what happened. Although less famous than the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression that had disrupted Fred Trump's early property career decades earlier, the 1980s boom ended abruptly on Black Monday, October 19, 1987, when stock markets suffered severe losses. While the broader stock market recovered relatively quickly, Manhattan real estate remained overvalued. This left Donald Trump and his associates holding a large volume of risky loans. Donald claimed he had sold his stocks a month before the crash, but even if true, this did not mitigate the larger issue of his real estate. Monday, October 19, 1987, when stock markets suffered severe losses. While the broader stock market recovered relatively quickly, Manhattan real estate remained overvalued. This left Donald Trump and his associates holding a large volume of risky loans. Donald claimed he had sold his stocks a month before the crash, but even if true, this did not mitigate the larger issue of his real estate loans. The exact amount Donald borrowed from Fred, or indirectly received through the Trump Organization, has been widely debated. Donald has claimed that he started with a small $1 million loan from his father. However, this likely referred to $1 million trusts Fred set up for each of his children in 1976. In reality, Fred's financial support of Donald far exceeded that. In 1978, Donald's first Manhattan project, a full redevelopment of the Commodore Hotel next to Grand Central Station on Park Avenue, began. To finance it, he secured a $70 million loan, half of which Fred personally guaranteed. If Donald had defaulted, Fred would have owed the bank $35 million. The Commodore reopened as the Grand Hyatt Hotel in 1980, and the loan was repaid. However, other loans from Fred to Donald in the 1980s were not so easily resolved. A legal document from 1985 indicated Donald owed Fred $14 million at the time, and this debt grew as Donald's business ventures, particularly in casinos, ran into trouble in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Like all Manhattan developers of the era, Donald suffered from the market downturn, and Fred experienced some impact as well, though he had significantly more financial cushioning. In 1982, when Forbes published its first list of the 400 richest Americans, Fred Trump's name appeared prominently, reflecting decades of strategic property development, government-backed projects, and rental income streams. Fred Trump appeared on the Forbes list at number 286, with an estimated fortune of $200 million, though some have argued it was substantially higher. However, the following years brought much greater challenges. Donald continued investing heavily in hotels, which drove him further into debt. Most notably, he entered the Atlantic City casino and hotel industry, purchasing multiple casinos from the mid-1980s onward. He invested hundreds of millions of dollars into these ventures, relying on massive loans with the expectation that the 1981-1987 economic boom would continue indefinitely. Instead, after a weak recovery following the 1987 crash, the Western world entered a recession in the early 1990s. Casinos struggled during economic downturns, and Donald's decision to acquire multiple properties in Atlantic City meant he was effectively competing against himself. By 1990, he was falling behind on interest payments. Fred stepped in to help. He sent his lawyer, Howard Snyder, to the Trump Castle Casino to purchase 670 gray chips, each valued at $5,000, totaling $3,035 million. The next day, a similar transaction added $150,000, bringing the total to 3.5 million. This effectively allowed Fred to provide Donald with $3.5 million to cover his loan payments without incurring a taxable gift. Legally, Fred had simply instructed his lawyer to buy hundreds of casino chips, which could be cashed in at any time. Although he clearly never intended to redeem the chips, the Casino Control Commission disagreed and fined Donald $65,000. As Donald's financial troubles worsened in the early 1990s, Fred's health was also declining. In his mid-80s, he was suffering from various age-related ailments. In October 1991, he was diagnosed with a mild form of dementia, which worsened over time. For example, when Donald married his second wife, Marla Maples, at the Plaza Hotel in New York on December 20th, 1993, Fred acted as best man, but he had to be reminded why he was there. Despite his health issues, he was still aware that Donald had effectively entered bankruptcy proceedings in 1991, and that he would eventually lose the Plaza Hotel and his 3 Atlantic City casinos, the Taj Mahal, Trump Plaza, and Trump Castle.